Welcome back to Face the Nation. We're continuing our conversation with Texas Republican Congressman Will Hurd. To pick up where we left off, we were talking about how your home district is going to be impacted by this emergency declaration. Today, White House senior advisor Stephen Miller told Fox News' Chris Wallace that the White House has the authorities to build a couple hundred miles by the end of the next appropriations cycle, which is September 2020. You sit on House Appropriations. Can Congress or the courts stop the administration from getting the money to do this?
Well, what this national emergency declaration does is it says the president is going to obligate funds, so he's going to take funds from other places, but you can't spend $8 billion in the next 6 months. And so what I think you're going to see in the next appropriation cycle is restricting some of that funds. And then the question you have is when it comes to military construction, right? Can you take funds from that was going to be used to constructing things in the military? And you outlined a couple of items earlier in this segment, but how about the fact that in my district, in Del Rio, Texas, this produces more pilots than any other facility in the United States of America. If it rains more than an inch, the flight line gets flooded and they can't train. We've been working on fixing that. We're trying to get more additional funds. If you're going to reprogram money, that's a good place to spend that kind of money rather than trying to build a wall. And we have to remember, there's already 654 miles of wall or barrier or whatever you want to call it, steel fencing. The president has already been authorized over $55 million. In this last appropriation bill, he was able to reauthorize $750 million within Homeland Security. My concern is our government wasn't designed to operate by national emergency. Unfortunately, a Congress that existed before I was born usurped some of their power, gave some of their power away to the executive branch. Our government was designed for the most ultimate power, the power of the purse, to reside within Congress, and we shouldn't have an executive, I don't care if it's Republican or Democrat, that tries to get around Congress with this national emergency declaration.
So would you support a resolution to try to stop the president from doing that?
I would support something that reviews how you declare a national emergency. I would support something that actually is going to prevent taking money out of military construction. That's going to go to our men and women who are willing to put on a uniform, put themselves in harm's way, and they need to make sure that we have the tools that they're properly trained and they're properly equipped to do things. So I'm always open to making sure that Congress takes back some of its power as a co-equal branch of government, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of conversations. We're almost in uncharted territory because I think, based on my research, this is one of the first times that there's been a disagreement between the executive branch and Congress on what is indeed a national emergency. It sets a dangerous precedent, but there will be a lot of people focusing on this over the next couple of weeks.
So to be clear, you are saying that this wall that you don't think the United States needs on national security grounds will actually adversely impact national security because it will hurt the readiness of some of these military bases in your district?
If you're taking money away from the military, we just spent the last 4 years rebuilding our military, making sure the men and women in our armed forces have the tools that they need. I don't want to see that money being taken away from that. We went through a number of hearings and investigations in order to figure out where that money needs to go. And so that is how our government is supposed to operate.
And you're confident that Congress can stop that money from being raided from those military construction funds, the $3.6 billion?
I would say that people are going to be exploring how that can ultimately be done because we're in uncharted territory. But I want to also make it clear that $67 billion worth of drugs are coming into our country. 400,000 people came to our country illegally last year. We have a problem at our border. We don't have what I call operational control of our border, meaning we know everything that's going back and forth across our border. So this is a problem. And the only way we solve the problem is looking at all 2,000 miles of our southern border at the same time. And the only way you can do that is with manpower and technology. In some places, a physical barrier makes sense where there's urban-to-urban contact. Again, we already have 654 miles of physical barrier. So we got to be thinking about the strategy, not a focus on just one tool within that strategy.
Congressman, thank you very much for joining us this Sunday. We will be right back with our panel. We want to bring in our panel now for some political analysis. David Nakamura covers the White House for The Washington Post. Rachael Bade covers Congress, and she has just moved over to The Washington Post. She's also a CNN political analyst. We want to welcome Eugene Scott to this broadcast. He's also with The Washington Post. And Leslie Sanchez is a CBS News contributor and a very familiar face to our viewers who tune in to CBSN, our digital network. Leslie, let me start with you. You heard the president lay out his case for this emergency. New York Times, though, in terms of writing about the fallout, said it was the most punishing defeat Mr. Trump has experienced as a president. Do you agree?
I don't think Republicans are going to agree on that. What's interesting, I was speaking to a lot of the legislative leaders and business leaders along the Texas-Mexico border, and they feel this is not a real solution, but a political one. But if you look at the fact that there's a tremendous amount of baseline support to secure the border, where the president does not have the support, is over 60%, according to what Gallup has been looking at, some other research, don't support the idea of a physical wall. So when it's parsing those words. I think, Margaret, if he can show he is securing with both technology, technical infrastructure, human capital, all the things that border enforcement is saying they need, then I think he's going to get a legislative win on that. However, if it just looks like a contiguous border, he's not. And I do want to point out the fact the president has walked that back. He was on numerous occasions saying, "I want the wall go the entire 2,000-mile border," but that's not the reality. So with that extent and that in mind, I think we're making progress.
Can I just follow up on, your mention that this is a political solution? Republicans on the Hill feel the same way, and they're very annoyed in some cases that they're being sort of unwittingly dragged into the president's 2020 reelection effort. The president feels the Trump and that declaring this emergency is going to help his own reelection, but this is dividing lawmakers, and you just saw that with your interviews right there with Will Hurd saying this was a bad idea, that he could see constituents have their land seized and that it would be taking money from the military, with people like Lindsey Graham saying, oh, this is going to secure our country. And so right now it's really dividing the party.
Just real quick on that part, and also in the conference, there was a big point of saying, not only with Congressman Hurd, but Congressman Henry Cuellar, who was also on the board of the Democrat, saying we want topography, the local law, leaders to be involved in the discussion, because you don't want to be building, eminent domain on people's lands, the issues of livestock and using the Rio Grande for other purposes. So there's a lot of disagreement on how that's done. But now that the president is backpedaling on how you secure the border, I think there can be a positive.
I would add one thing, was whether this is a win or a loss for the president. I mean, the president wants to be seen as the ultimate winner here, but just look at his news conference in announcing this. It took him about 5 minutes to even get to the idea that he was declaring an national emergency. He was acknowledging it was probably going to be stopped in court. He didn't act like a winner in sort of announcing this in the Rose Garden the way he did. He took questions on a lot of other topics, which is fine. We want to hear him make news. But if he really believed in what he was doing here, believed this was a really, truly winning strategy, I think you would have seen a much more determinative announcement in the way that he rolled that out.
But one of the reasons I believe that the president was not able to communicate the national emergency in a winsome way is because it's not winsome. It's widely unpopular with many people outside of his base, which is where the majority of voters are. We know that this is an approach that is popular with Republicans who back Trump, but we know that he won because so many independents came over to support him, and he needs those votes as well if he's going to do well in 2020. And recent polling, especially after the midterm, shows that he's not doing well with those voters.
Rachel, I want to ask you about the other news we have here from that tremendous interview with 60 Minutes and Andrew McCabe. Look, McCabe's gone. Jim Comey is gone. There's a new Attorney General, Bill Barr, who's now on the job, and Senator Lindsey Graham is now in the chairmanship of the Judiciary Committee. So where does all of this head next?
That story is not over. McCabe may be gone. Rosenstein is heading toward the exits. But this whole notion about this 25th Amendment and whether there was actually a conversation to try to oust the president or see if there was support to oust the president, Republicans are going to continue in that vein. And it's interesting from this interview, it looks like Lindsey Graham, as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, is going to pick up right where House Republicans left off when they lost the majority and Democrats took over. Before the past 2 years, Republicans in the House, they've sort of been doing this investigate the investigator, sort of an inquiry about whether there's bias at the FBI or the Justice Department. that has gone away. They've lost their subpoena power. And Graham is showing that he's not only going to pick that up, he potentially is going to go even further by telling you that he is willing to subpoena Rosenstein and bring in McCabe to actually ask him what happened with these conversations.
And where does that fit in, Eugene, to the political strategy here in terms of laying the groundwork for the Mueller report?
Well, I would imagine that in part it is to keep people questioning Mueller and the bias that the president believes exists within the FBI that's working against him. It's the whole witch hunt idea just taken to the next step, trying to put some meat on those bones and looking at people like Lindsey Graham to be able to do that and argue that the president's suspicions are credible and they're not irrational. Whether or not they're actually going to be able to do that, people are still waiting to see. But what we do know is that most Americans, according to polling we have in the Washington Post, want to see this investigation continue because they do believe that Mueller is more likely to be credible than the president himself.
David, switching gears here, we heard overnight that Heather Nauert, who had been at the State Department as an undersecretary and as a spokesperson there, is withdrawing her name from consideration to be the next UN ambassador. What happened? Why did she do that?
What we understand is that her nomination was languishing in part because her own team had not even forwarded all their necessary paperwork to the Senate committee that would have to do her oversight hearing. And I think the reason now we're finding out is that she actually employed a nanny who was in the country legally from another country, but had not been necessarily had a work permit to work here legally. Taxes were not being paid on time. Nauert had apparently flagged this internally, but it's become something of an issue of this potentially being a problem and a disqualifying a measure, something that would be embarrassing not only to her family, but also could stand in the way from the Senate moving forward. This is a blow to the administration, though, because she's certainly someone I think that the president had grown to trust in her role as a spokeswoman at the State Department. And he'd had his own, President Trump had his own problems with the previous UN Secretary, Nikki Haley, in some cases. And he believes this would be someone who would be very loyal to him, but they now seem to be making the decision to move on.
Leslie, is it disqualifying?
For some it is, and for some it's not. It just reminds me of the 1993 Nannygate, when you had the revelations, that Bill Clinton was trying to nominate not one, but two attorney generals that both had issues with nannies who were undocumented. But in more recent history, under Bill Clinton, and even if you think about under Trump, Wilbur Ross, who had undocumented, perhaps they didn't pay taxes on people that worked domestically in their household, they managed to get through. So they're threading that needle. I think it's changed a lot in that conversation. But again, going back to our first topic, it becomes an issue of labor and undocumented individuals working in these households and not paying taxes.
But Rachel, some have put this in the context of the president has had this happen with a few different nominees, or at least people he said he's going to nominate. Is the White House really setting up their selections for success? The president's tweeting this morning blaming Democrats for stalling his ambassadors from being confirmed.
Yeah, look, that's just a way to sort of shift the narrative and try to point the finger. There's been complaints, including by some Republicans on the Hill. The White House does not do enough to vet people before they actually put them forward. And so, yeah, this has been an issue. Mick Mulvaney, now the acting chief of staff, he had his own issue with not paying taxes for, again, I believe it was a nanny. So again, it's an embarrassment for the administration, and Republicans would like to see them button that up before they actually move people forward.
And it comes on the heels of all this reporting in the Washington Post and other places, the New York Times, about the president's own employment of undocumented workers at his golf club for years, at a time that he was running for president and railing on the use of undocumented immigrants, now declaring this a national emergency. So this would have fed into all sorts of other questions that Congress and certainly Democratic lawmakers will want to ask.
Eugene, we had two of our senators as guests from Munich, from the security conference, and there's been a lot said about the importance or the statement being made to have such a big congressional delegation at what is a conference built around celebrating alliances, something that the administration is often criticized for not valuing enough. You had former Vice President Biden there, you had the current Vice President Mike Pence there. What was the reaction like in terms of Pence's message to the room?
Well, for the most part, it was silent. There was a lack of confidence in the message that Mike Pence was delivering, suggesting that the America First mindset that the president has been campaigning on and leading since entering the Oval Office is of the best interest for the world as a whole. On multiple occasions, lines that he's used to receiving applause and taking breaks for were met with silence, in part because we know that many of our European allies do not see the United States as any longer a world leader when it comes to security issues, and boldly disagree with much of what the president has put forward. And it's telling to see how surprised Pence himself was that he wasn't met with the same type of support that he usually is met with when he's making these same statements on the campaign trail or within groups here in the States that are used to supporting him and backing what the president believes to be in the best interest for the country and the world.
And David, in contrast to that, Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, was well received. Her remarks, it was noted, she said she doesn't understand how possibly her country could be called a national security threat when BMWs are made in the United States these days. It was almost like a laugh line at the president's trade policies here, and saying here that he's vacating space to Iran. Our closest allies are really at a distance.
Yeah, it's no surprise that Angela Merkel's been at odds with President Trump, but she seemed, in this case, to be unbound by any concerns about her own political future, given that she's probably not, as said, she won't pursue another term as chancellor. But think about this. I was just thinking about last September at the UN General Assembly in New York. President Trump came up and said he'd done more than any other president in 2 years. He got laughed at. He went to France and Paris for the 100th year anniversary of World War I. And Emmanuel Macron, the French president, came up and delivered a very pointed rebuke of nationalism and things that Trump has talked about, with Trump right there in the audience. And now Vice President Pence goes to this Munich security conference and basically agreed with silence. I mean, what's worse, getting laughed at or having sort of radio silence? I'm not sure what's worse, but there continues to be this message, and Angela Merkel on her final sort of tour here in the next couple of years will be continuing to deliver this pointed rebuke of Trump.
I think that's why you saw a lot of lawmakers joining at Munich this weekend, because they wanted to go there to reassure our allies that we are still on your side. I mean, former Vice President Joe Biden also gave this speech to the audience, talking about how when I travel around the country and I talk to Americans, Americans still see you guys as important to our national security, that we still want to be in NATO and we're not looking at leaving NATO. Even the president had talked about doing such a couple of weeks ago. So you're seeing this sort of bipartisan pushback on the president, including several votes in the House and the Senate where they've actually rebuked the president's foreign policy. So we're just going to have to see, as time goes on, are more Republicans working with him on that to push back and sort of reclaim our standing in the world.
I think it's an important point, and we'll leave it there on that. Also interesting that Vice President Biden, former Vice President, was there. We haven't heard a lot from those who are expected to throw their hat into the ring for 2020 on national security, but he staked that out, at least for the weekend. We'll be back in a moment with former Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe. We're back with former Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe, who's here to talk about his new book, Beyond Charlottesville, Taking a Stand Against White Nationalism. It's out in July and looks at what led to the violent Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville and how Virginia and the country continue to deal with racism. Good to have you here. Certainly your state of Virginia continues to deal with racism. The governor, Northam, who we heard from last week, has refused to resign, despite near universal calls among elected Democrats to do so. Can he survive?
Yes, I think he's made the decision he's going to stand, but the way that Ralph survives and brings Virginia back together, he's got to lean in on these very important issues, which I talk about in the book. He's got to use executive authority as governor. You know, I used executive authority. I took the Confederate flag off the Virginia license plates. I banned the box on any state employment forms. And as you know, I restored the felon rights of 173,000 individuals, more than any governor in U.S. history. I was sued by the Republicans. We ultimately won. And the reason I was so adamant about doing that was because of Virginia's racial history. It goes back to the Jim Crow laws. In 1902, a state senator, disenfranchisement of felons, a poll tax, and a literacy test, to put it in our Constitution. And his quote that day is, "I'm doing this to eliminate the darky from being a political factor in Virginia." Well, 114 years later, there was a new sheriff in town, and I was able to enfranchise all these people to give them a second chance. And this is what our leadership in Virginia needs to do. We need to lean in. We've had a horrible history. You look at Charlottesville, Margaret, I can't even say to you on TV what I heard that day against members of the African American community and members of the Jewish faith. These people walking down the streets, they used to wear hoods. They used to do it at night because they were embarrassed. They don't feel they have to wear hoods anymore, and they can do it in broad daylight. Something has gone wrong in our country. And I talk in the book about how we got to bring our country back together again. We got to deal with the issues of the past, but we need to go forward.
What about the Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax, who faces sexual assault charges? Can he survive?
Very serious allegations have been made. They need to be investigated. He has called for an investigation. The two women have called for an investigation. I believe this week in Massachusetts, they've opened up an investigation, and I believe the Duke University has opened up an investigation. So we will go through that process. What I'm hoping now is what has happened here, that, we're a great state, and I was very proud as governor. I eliminated all the horrible biases that we had. Remember when I came into office, the Republicans had wanted to shut all the women's clinics down. We had horrible legislation against women, the transvaginal bill, horrible legislation against members of the LGBT. We got rid of all that. We became open, welcoming. That's why we got Amazon. There was no question. I put the bid in.
I want to ask you about that.
Yeah, that's why we got Amazon. You cannot succeed as a governor. You cannot grow your state unless you're perceived as open and welcoming to everyone.
Well, so New York, as you know, Amazon pulled out of New York after they had bid for this facility there. But some of the outcry locally and then nationally from progressives was saying this is a win against big corporations. This is a win for the little guy. I mean, for you, what do you think the impact is? Does this in any way paint the Democratic Party as well as anti-business?
I certainly hope not. Listen, I put the bid in for Amazon in September 17 while I was governor. Before I put the bid in, I worked with my state legislators. I worked with all of the local communities in Northern Virginia and Richmond and Hampton Roads. So when our bid went in, everybody was all in. I cannot for the life of you understand after this bid went in why the locals came out against it. You should have done the due diligence before you submitted the bid. It just doesn't make any sense. But more importantly, our bid, and we won, and we're going to create 25 up to 37,000 jobs in Virginia, high-paying jobs. You've got to build an economy for the future. I just read a report that artificial intelligence will eliminate 40% of the world's jobs in the next 2 decades. You better be creating new 21st century jobs. We welcome Amazon. Now, they don't get any money until they come in, create the jobs, and pay the taxes. It's all how you structure the deal. So if Jeff Bezos, if you're watching here, thank you for coming to Virginia. You don't want to go to New York? I would tell you, bring the other jobs to Virginia. We are an open, welcoming, dynamic state. We're the #1 state for cyber, for data, for unmanned systems.
I've got to, before I let you go, though, ask you, March 31st, you set as your deadline to announce whether you're running for president. What are you waiting for? Is it Joe Biden?
I'm not. I have spoken with the vice president. I've made hundreds and hundreds of calls across the country. Talk to potential staff, and listen, we're close to make a decision. I want to see where the field is. I do think we need in this race a progressive governor who was very jobs-oriented, very successful in economic development. They're not mutually exclusive. A governor is a CEO. We build roads, we fix roads. We do need governors in this race because, we don't just get to talk all day. We got to deliver every single day.
Well, we'd love to have you back and talk about it when you're ready to make a decision,
Thank you.
Governor. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you all for watching. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.